All right, folks, let's pick up with this idea of slavery again. And as I go back to the outline today, maybe y'all are going to remember a little bit that we had left off with slavery with some compromises that were actually in the Constitution. We had left off, if you remember, with the Three-Fifths Clause. We had left off with the idea of the 1808 Compromise that ended the international slave trade. And then, if you remember, we had ended up with the Fugitive Slave Clause if slaves happened to run away from southern slave areas into northern free areas. Well, we're going to fast forward, and we're really going to begin to fast forward for a few decades, and then ultimately we're going to take it up to the Civil War because the country never solved the issue. They basically just kicked the can down the road. Now, what they began to do, and this is kind of an important thing, you know, Congress at any point theoretically could have voted slavery away. Okay. But what they would typically do is they would typically add two states in fairly rapid succession. And the idea was is that for every free state, they would add a slave state, or depending upon the order, for every slave state, they would add a free state, so that in fact the United States Senate would always stay tied. And as long as the Senate stayed tied, then nobody could officially vote slavery down. And that means that the current status quo would remain. Now, a big part of this, and you'll look at this map that I show you here in just a second as I juggle my screens, was the old Missouri Compromise. And I believe you can see this now. As you take a look at this, y'all, you're going to notice up there that the green, the olive colored territories are the slave states. The yellow colored areas are the slave territories. And then there's kind of a burnt orange and maybe a fall orange that are the free states and the free territories. But the really key part of this is this Missouri Compromise line, as they've got down here. And you'll notice there it is right above the Arkansas Territory. And the idea basically was this. With the Missouri Compromise, they had decided that every state that would go above 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude, which was the latitude line. That's what the latitude of this line was. Every state, with the exception of Missouri, was going to be created as a free state. And every state that would be created under 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude was actually going to be a slave state. Now, if you look at this, and I know that it's a little subtle, this line has a little bit of kind of a slope upwards on it. And eyeballing this map, it kind of looks like there was going to be a lot more potential free territory than, in fact, there was going to be potential slave territory. But bottom line was that they would typically add several states, couple of states at a time, one slave, one free, so that nobody could ever vote slavery out. It basically just maintained the status quo. Now, this went on for a while, and I'm going to fast forward a few more decades now and get to Dred Scott. Dred Scott v. Sanford, y'all, is considered by many, almost everybody really, the worst decision that the Supreme Court ever rendered. And it's considered this for a couple of different reasons. Now, Dred Scott was a slave. And if you go back in time on this, Dred Scott was a slave at the time, and his owner had basically given him a promise that said, "Look, you're gonna be free when I die." And the widow was in on this as well. And of course, the owner did eventually die. It's funny, though, if you look back on this, there was some question about whether or not Dred Scott's freedom was actually going to be recognized. There was some question about whether Dred Scott's freedom would actually be recognized. So Dred Scott versus Sanford was kind of an organized case. The widow had decided, in fact, that she wanted to lose in going to court. The idea was that if the now dead owner or the widow, who would die, fairly soon as well, when they died, who would really be there to vouch for Dred Scott? Because Dred Scott really probably wouldn't be able to vouch for himself, at least not in, white society. So she basically said to herself, and this was kind of the mindset of this case, if the Supreme Court says you're free, then you're always going to be free. And it's not going to be my word or my husband's word or any of these other things the widow's thinking, but it's going to be the word of the Supreme Court. There's going to be a case. People are going to know about this. And the Supreme Court actually was kind of itching to get involved into this as well, because if you go back and you think about this for just a second, we've been kicking this slavery can down the road since the 1780s. And now we're getting up into the 1850s. I mean, we're talking about a generation or more, in fact, that we're basically dealing with this high situation in the Senate. So the Supreme Court did rule. And the Supreme Court basically kind of said to themselves, look, at the political branches are not they're not resolving this. So we are going to be the ones to do so. And they struck down the Missouri Compromise. And this is effectively what they said. Now, I'm going to pull this map back up for just a second, and I want you to think for just a second about your own lives. I would imagine that a number of you may have a car or a truck already, right? And, if you are if your car is your car in Georgia, then theoretically, because your car is your property, it would be your property in Pennsylvania, in Maine, in Florida territory, or clear out here into Oregon country. Where you are in the country doesn't take away your property. Well, the Supreme Court said that Dred Scott, as a slave, was not a man, but the Supreme Court said Dred Scott was property. And just like your car in modern times is your car wherever you take it, just like your horse would be your horse in modern times wherever you took it, just like your this or whatever would be yours wherever you take it. If Dred Scott is property, Dred Scott is property no matter where Dred Scott would be taken in the country. So it doesn't matter if it's below this 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude. It doesn't matter if it's in Missouri, which is the one exception where it was legal to have slavery. It didn't matter if it was any of these other states either. The only thing that mattered was that Dred Scott was property. Now, in striking this down, this is bad enough to say in black and white writing that, in fact, a man is not a man, but a man is property. But this case led directly to the Civil War. And y'all, to this day, by far, and this is counting World War I, World War II, anything that's been involved in the Middle East, the Revolutionary War, any of them, we suffered more casualties than every single other conflict or war the United States has been involved in our history in the Civil War. Let me say that again. We suffered more casualties in the Civil War than everything else combined in American history. That's how devastating this was. So I give this to you. The Missouri Compromise was struck down. Your property was your property everywhere, not just above or below a 36-degree, 30-minute north latitude line. And in fact, they said point blank that a man wasn't a man, but a man was property. And they also, this decision led directly to the most devastating war in American history. It's probably not a surprise that this was considered such an awful, awful decision. As I go forward with the outline, you'll notice in here, and I'm not going to get into the Civil War necessarily. That's probably more for an American history class. But in the aftermath of the Civil War, there were the Reconstruction or the Civil War amendments, the Reconstruction amendments, the Civil War amendments. Just depends on who you talk to as far as what these were called. And all of the southern states had actually seceded, and they had created a confederation, right? The Confederacy, in the aftermath or in the fighting of the Civil War. Well, all of them, when they left the country, they had to ratify these Civil War amendments in order to rejoin. Let me give you some text on some of these, and bear with me as I juggle my screen here for just a second. But the first one is actually going to be the 13th Amendment. And this, y'all, was actually passed almost immediately in the aftermath of the Civil War. And this was the one that ended slavery. It ended slavery and involuntary servitude. And I think you can see this now. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Now, I think the slavery part is pretty straightforward. I mean, they're saying that it's done now. And these defeated states in the Civil War had to ratify this in order to rejoin the Union, and they were being forced to rejoin the Union, make no mistake, because they lost the war. So there wasn't going to be slavery. Now, what might throw you a little bit is this term involuntary servitude. And involuntary servitude basically says that you can't be forced to work against your will. Now, I would imagine that maybe some of y'all are sports fans. And if you are a sports fan, maybe you've got a favorite player who is really good. And maybe your favorite player, probably deserves to be the highest paid in a given sport. Well, here's the thing, y'all, as you look at this. While a player might deserve to be the highest paid, oftentimes they sign contracts, long-term contracts, and in a year or two, or maybe even sooner than that, they are not only not the highest paid anymore because other players want to get their money, but they might be outside of the top 5 or the top 10 of highest paid. And you'll see these athletes sometimes, hold out to get a contract renegotiated or hold out to get a little bit of extra money. Well, you would think if you signed a contract to play ball, that the business, the team, could actually force you to play. No, not under the 13th Amendment. Forcing you to play against your will would actually be involuntary servitude, and that's unconstitutional. So that, y'all, is the 13th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment comes into play. And the 14th Amendment, y'all, is got a mix of things that are actually in here. And let me kind of take these step by step for just a second. You're going to notice here in this first section, and this first section's really the important part of this, really, even in modern times. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. There is no more, y'all, this 3/5. There is no more a man is property. This is, hey, all persons that are born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. Now understand on this. When the federal government won the Civil War, y'all, they defeated the states. Some people would say that Civil War was actually about states' rights or the war for Southern independence and not slavery. And there's some truth to that too. Just depends on, which argument you want to listen to. But notice after they lost what this amendment goes on to say. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States. Privileges and immunities, that should ring a bell. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. In other words, the federal constitution is basically legally putting the states in their place, and they're giving the federal government the ability to enforce this. Now, let me fast forward to 2025. Notice that very first sentence up there. All persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. Okay, here's the thing on this. This amendment was designed to deal specifically with slavery. This was designed to deal with issues of the 1860s. This was designed to end slavery. But if you really read it there, it says point blank, if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen of the United States. Well, let's say that a woman who is 8 months pregnant and a Mexican citizen crosses the border illegally into Texas and happens to give birth to a young son or a young daughter. Well, you might say that this amendment is not designed to deal with that. But if you just read the language, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States. It sure sounds like that young newborn son or daughter is now a citizen of the United States, irrespective of the legal status of the mother, irrespective or how or why she got into the country, irrespective of anything to do with the father. The term, and I don't even know if this is appropriate anymore, but you'll hear people refer derisively to the term of anchor babies, where someone will go and give birth that is not a legal resident of the United States. Their child now is, under the 14th Amendment, a legal citizen of the United States. And so, in order to care for the child, the mother would be allowed to stay in the country. It's like the child anchors the mother in the United States. Now, listen, I don't know, and I read the words, and it says that somebody should be a citizen if they're born here. But if you look at the context of the amendment, it wasn't the context dealing with this issue that we're talking about today. And I bring this up to you because there are folks that really want to amend the 14th Amendment, not because it has anything to do with slavery, but because of what it has to do with undocumented immigration. So kind of keep that thought in mind. This is actually still out there. Let me skip down to section 3. And actually, let me go to section 2 really quick. And you'll notice up here it says representatives shall be apportioned among the several states according to their respective numbers, counting the whole number of persons in each state. Remember that 3/5 clause? Well, if you're counting the whole number of persons in each state, now there's no more 3/5 of a person anymore. The 14th Amendment addressed that. And then section 3, and it kind of stands to reason that if you just had this big fight over slavery and you just fought this civil war, and it's, at the time, the most incredible devastation that the country has ever faced. To this day, it's still the most incredible devastation that the country has ever faced. You might not want the people that left the country back in positions of leadership. So you see some of the anger here on section 3. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector of president and vice president or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state who, having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislator or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution, shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same, or given aid or comfort to the enemies thereof. In other words, if you had taken an oath to uphold the Constitution as an elected official, whether you were at any level of the federal government or you were at the state level, they were forbidding you from being able to go back into the Congress again. They were forbidding you from holding elected office again. And this was the anger. They didn't want to repeat the mistakes. Because if you throw the people, these people left, they seceded from the country, and then you just immediately allow them to come back. What are the tensions going to be like? Let's get new people in there that haven't actually engaged in insurrection or rebellion. Now, let me get to that insurrection or rebellion, and let me fast forward to modern times. I thought it was really, really odd on January 6th how fast the news networks, and I think that day I was watching CNN, how fast the news networks came up with insurrection at the Capitol. I thought that was an interesting word. Maybe it was just drama, maybe it was eye-catching, or maybe there was some socialization involved in this. Because if you really think about it, why would you say that Trump was engaged in insurrection or rebellion? Because Section 3 of the 14th Amendment says that no person shall be, if you've taken an oath, then you are not going to be allowed to run for office if you have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the country, against the Constitution. It's almost like they were trying to make it so that Trump would never be allowed to run again. And some of his second impeachment was really based on this kind of argument. So I give this to you. The 14th Amendment, y'all, is something from almost 150 years ago. Actually, maybe even a little bit longer than that, 170 years ago. But as I talk to you about this today, the bottom line for our purposes is that yeah, it was from a long time ago. But when you consider this idea of insurrection or rebellion, or when you consider the idea of natural born citizenship, these are issues that are still out there, and people are fighting over these today. Y'all, I'm going to post a bonus video, a bonus quiz, in fact, for bonus points dealing with the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment of the Civil War Reconstruction Amendments are going to be that's actually going to be dealing with the right to vote. And you might be surprised, the 15th Amendment didn't give everybody the right to vote. It did something else. And in that video, we talk about how maybe that was planned or how maybe that was just an accident, but it's not the same as actually giving people the right to vote. Y'all, I will stop here on this video and keep it a little short. I'll pick it up in a minute.